And joining us to talk more about this is Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who joins us live on the broadcast from Canberra. Malcolm Davis, thanks very much indeed for talking to WION this afternoon. Now, we saw that Tuesday was the deadliest single-day attack in the war this year, and Russia used ballistic missiles. With all its recent gains, particularly in the east of Ukraine, has Russia proved it's obviously the stronger military force and has vast air superiority?
Look, I think you are seeing the Russians making steady advances in the east around Donetsk towards Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk. And I think what's happening is the Ukrainians are undermanned, they're running low on ammunition, and so they're having to withdraw in order to preserve their forces, and that's basically ceding ground. The Russians are filling that ground and basically making advances. At the same time, you've got these very effective air and missile strikes that are occurring. The Russians not needing to actually fly their aircraft inside Ukrainian airspace. They can launch these glide bombs and these cruise missiles from outside Ukrainian airspace whilst they're in Russia. And so they can strike at targets with impunity across Ukraine. Ukraine only has limited air defense missile capabilities provided by the West. So Ukraine is in a bad situation at the moment.
Yeah, and as it is in a bad situation, Malcolm Davis, heads are beginning to roll in Ukraine, and more cabinet reshuffles are likely, even as Zelensky is heading to the US to meet Biden, and obviously will be talking about those air defense systems that he believes are hugely required at this moment.
Exactly, and it's not just the defensive systems that are necessary to shoot down incoming missiles. It's also that Zelensky wants the Biden administration to lift onerous constraints on the ability of Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons to strike deep in Russia. If these restrictions are lifted, then Ukraine can hit air bases from which these Russian air attacks are coming from, and thus stop these attacks from occurring. That will help save lives. It will reduce the pressure on the Ukrainians, potentially allowing them to stabilize their defensive lines and preventing a Russian breakout near Pokrovsk. And I think it's really important that the Biden administration actually listens to what Zelensky is saying and accepts that these constraints are unacceptable, immoral, and need to be lifted as soon as possible.
Right. And as we see the Russians making more and more gains going forward in this war, do you think things have dramatically changed and the NATO members, the West and America, will have to sit down and rethink some of their strategies of support in Ukraine? And which also means...
Look, I think that...
Yeah.
I mean, I think that any rethink would need to be along the lines of, rather than, we stand with Ukraine, that the policy must be, we must ensure Ukraine wins. It cannot be that NATO decides Ukraine can't win, so therefore they turn their backs on Ukraine. I think what needs to happen is for NATO to sit down and look at what their strategy is and recognize they need to do more. They need to step up and they need to provide additional weapons to Ukraine. They need to remove any constraints on the use of those weapons. And they may also need to think about some sort of direct involvement, either by providing a limited missile defense zone in western Ukraine, so that frees up Ukrainian forces there to go to the east. And I think Poland has already indicated a willingness to shoot down Russian missiles that are approaching Polish territory over Ukraine. So these are the sorts of things that I think NATO needs to do. It certainly should not think about withdrawing support and essentially abandoning Ukraine.
Yeah. And so going forward, you certainly feel that the time for wait and watch in this war has gone for the West, particularly for NATO members and the US, and of course maintaining of status quo as the Russians continue to make substantial gains. Now, the head of the International Atomic Energy has said that the situation at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is very fragile following the recent attack close by. Are you hopeful that both sides will be wary of that kind of an escalation in this war?
Oh, actually, I worry that the Russians would use the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a kind of grey zone nuclear threat. They hold it, they control it. If they wanted to, they could try to release radioactivity and claim that it was some sort of Ukrainian operation. That's the nature of a false flag operation by the Russians, and certainly that would be some sort of step short of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So I do not believe that we should expect the Russians will do the right thing and honor their obligations under the International Atomic Energy Agency. In fact, I think the Russians will use Zaporizhzhia as basically a sword of Damocles over the Ukrainian people. And indeed, when you talk about radiation and the radiation clouds blowing in the wind, the rest of Europe.
Yeah, and while you talk about this direct involvement of the NATO possibly in some areas, how do we de-escalate the situation going forward if it were to? I mean, what sort of negotiations would it require? What sort of involvement possibly would it require from a country like China, maybe India?
You don't negotiate with the Russians. Essentially, you defeat them. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. If we start negotiating with the Russians, then any negotiation requires give or take on both sides. The Russians would essentially demand that they control the territories that they have gained, they have annexed through military aggression. They would demand that Ukraine not join NATO. That's unacceptable. So therefore, I do not think the time for negotiations is now. I think you negotiate from a position of strength. So what needs to happen is that the West needs to ensure that Ukraine regains the momentum, regains the offensive, and can push the Russians back out of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, and then you sit down and negotiate the terms of Russia's surrender, not give Russia essentially victory by default.
Right. Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defense Strategy, thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon, sharing those very important thoughts on what's going on in this war at the moment.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.